I heard that sound no one can ignore, a little kid coming apart behind a closed door. And even though I was just there to clean a glass house on a cliff in Rainier Cliffs, Washington, I went in, I sat on the rug real slow, like you approach a stray dog. You don't want to spook, and I told a story about a tiny ship and a fog that wouldn't lift. The boy. Leo hiccuped his cries down and set his cheek on my shoulder like it had always been his spot, which is exactly when his father, Cole Whitman, filled the doorway with that cold CEO voice and said, "What are you doing in his room? You don't touch my son. You don't even speak to him. Are those instructions too complicated?" And I said he wasn't angry, he was scared, but he fired me on the spot and told security to handle my paperwork. So I laid Leo down, and he reached for me half asleep, and that almost split me in two. But I left the envelope of hush pay on the counter, and walked into air that tasted like metal, because grief had been living inside that house since Cole's wife died on the water, and you could feel it like glass in your lungs. And I told myself not to cry, because crying doesn't keep the lights on, you know what I mean. The agency waiting room had those buzzing lights that make you think your life's a mistake, and I was doing the math on rent when a black SUV slid to the curb, and the window dropped, and Cole said, "I came to talk," and I said, "Talk. Or finish the lecture." And he said I made a mistake, which is not a sentence rich men enjoy. And then he said, "Leo fell asleep holding your blue dish towel like a life jacket." And I stared at the city so he wouldn't see my face, and he asked me to come back, please. And I said I would, if he could stop treating a child like an asset and start calling thunder, thunder, not defiance, just weather. And he exhaled like a man setting down the only weapon he trusts, and said, "Agreed." And yeah, that happened. Back at the house, the morning smelled like pancakes instead of money, and Leo patted in with bed hair and that blue towel, and he didn't scream or swipe. He nodded one small nod that felt like a country announcing it exists. So we built little rituals that didn't pretend to be miracles, 10 barefoot minutes in the yard, rain or shine, lavender on the pillow, humming that isn't a tune so much as a hand on your back. And then we built a place too, a curved path of flat stones and a patch of moss and wind chimes that hush instead of shout. And we called it Leo's Harbor, because names matter when you're trying to belong. And Cole looked at dirt on his shoes and said, "I haven't seen this since college," and I said, "That explains a lot," and he laughed like something cracked and let light in. Trouble came smiling, not kicking. Trent Morrow, my old landlord with a leather jacket attitude, leaned on the gate with a flat package and a grin, said, he found something in my old mailbox, peeled the paper back, and there it was. Corduroy Moloch's favorite from before we left that apartment, with 2 trash bags and a prayer. And he said maybe I'd like to settle up now that I had a view, and I told him I'd pay what I owed when I could, and he didn't get to stand in my life and pretend it was his. And the gate hummed, and Cole's voice came calm and final. "You made your point, leave," and Trent backed away with both hands up, like the kind of man who enjoys the dance more than the bill. And that night, I put corduroy on Leo's nightstand, because sometimes the right book is a bridge across a loud hour. The blogs did what blogs do. A bad photo at the gate, a worse caption, billionaire's nanny or secret lover, whichever earns their rent. And we didn't feed the noise, but quiet doesn't always kill it. So I took Leo to the Beacon Arts Center for Family Sensory Hour, a room where nobody stares if you flap or hum, and he dipped one finger in yellow and then blue and then red, and whispered home tiny, like a bird landing on your finger, and Cole didn't turn it into a slideshow. He just let it be, and a woman with silver curls squeezed my arm and said, "You've got a gift," and I said, "No, ma'am, I've just stayed long enough to learn his language, and that's the whole thing right there if you're listening." The twist hit like a bad smell. An unmarked envelope, a zoomed photo from the trees beyond the fence, Leo tucked under my arm while I laughed at something off camera, and scrawled across the bottom, "Ask her who the father really is." So we tightened security cameras on every tree that could hold one without spooking the birds. And that night, a clink on the patio, and there's a motel key on the step number 12 tag, scratched, remember? And I looked at that cheap brass and smiled the way you smile at a mosquito. Polite, murderous. Because it wasn't about fear, it was leverage. And I've paid enough interest on that to know the rate, you know what I mean. Cole pulled threads in places Trent thought he'd vacuumed calls to people who used to work the same schemes, emails to a lawyer who reads paper like prophecy. And I called a different kind of help Renee Alvarez, a reporter who doesn't grind human stories into clickbait. And she came with a notebook and a recorder and asked, "Are you in love with him?" And I said, "That's not what this is about. This is about how people see a black woman near a white child and assume scandal before they assume care. It's about a boy who needed a harbor and found one, and she said, 'Then say that,' and I did, and when the piece ran long and honest and uncut, it didn't stop the noise, but it sat at the same table and looked it in the eye, and that's a start. Then the motion lights tripped in 3 corners at once, and security ran, and I stood in Leo's doorway with a kitchen knife tucked behind my thigh, like muscle memory that refuses to die. And they found footprints where cameras don't reach, and Cole's face went past mad into something that looked like vow. And the next morning, he flew north to meet a man with a conscience full of receipts, came back with a drive of emails. You don't write unless you think nobody will read them. A map of how Trent turned harassment into a business model. And while filings hit the clerk's desk, we released a 1.5 minutes of vid. The internet didn't know how to mock me in bad lighting, and a worse sweater on a nursery floor saying, "You're safe. You're safe. You're safe," until Leo's body believed me, the frame freezing on his smile, Cole's voice off camera saying, "This is who they said was a problem, and it wasn't polished. It was true, and truth traveled faster than the rumor that day." 3 days later, they picked Trent up on charges that had more teeth than trespassing. Cyberstalking, wire fraud, obstruction. And I didn't cheer. I stirred oatmeal and sang the blueberry song Leo loves, and watched him smear a blue circle and name it boat. And when you've ever waited for a storm to name you safe, you know why I didn't need balloons. Life didn't flip to fairy tale, it just got honest. Leo started half-days at a little inclusion preschool with walls that look like weather maps and teachers who don't flinch at stims. And I filed papers for Open Palms, a nonprofit to train and back up in-home caregivers, especially black women who get called the help, even when they are the help that keeps a house from breaking. And we met in a church basement with coffee and paper cups and a whiteboard that didn't really want to write. And 10 women told the truth, and that was enough to light the pilot. People keep asking if Cole and I are a movie. Here's what I'll say. Porch swing with lemonades, and Leo between us kicking like he's practicing takeoff. And Cole asks what a real sensory garden would look like if money didn't get the loudest vote. And I tell him about paths that curve and swings that don't squeak and plants meant to be touched. And he listens. He's learned to listen. And that's rarer than diamonds. Where he's from, yeah, that happened too. So here's where you'll argue with me in the comments. Because every story needs a porch where neighbors disagree. Was I wrong to go back after getting fired even with terms? Was he wrong to bring me back, knowing what people would say about a billionaire? And his black caregiver, does intention matter when power is lopsided? Or is that just something people say when the camera's on? I don't know all of it. But I know when a child reaches for you, you reach back. And if rumor can twist that into sin, maybe we've said yes to the wrong gods. You know what I mean. I'll leave you with the picture that still wakes me at 3 a.m., in a good way. A boy in a garden we built with our hands, wind moving the chimes just enough to give you permission to breathe. his small palm pressing a flat white stone into my hand. "For the boat," he says. And we don't correct him, we add it to the path, and he steps forward, and we stay. If this hit you anywhere, real talk to me. Was it right or reckless? Did class and race warp the way people judged what they saw? Have you lived through a rumor that chewed a person and left a story? Drop your city, drop your take, tell me where you learned that staying can be a revolution. And if you want more stories told with their edges still on, hit like so. The next person searching for a harbor finds it faster.